Babylon, June, 323 BC. The greatest conqueror in human history is lying in a room, and he cannot move. He is 32 years old. His army stretches from Greece to the edges of the known world. No enemy has ever defeated him on a battlefield. Not one. In 13 years of continuous campaigning, across deserts and mountain ranges and rivers that no Greek army had ever crossed, he has never lost, and now his generals are filing past his bed. Honor by to look at him for the last time. He cannot speak. He can only watch them come in and watch them leave. Some of them are weeping. Some of them cannot look at his face. These are men who crossed the Hindu Kush with him. Men who stood in the front line at Gaugamela when the Persian Empire broke apart around them. Men who followed him into the Gedrosian desert when the sane choice was a different road. Men who believed, in the way that soldiers believe things that go beyond reason, that he was untouchable. He is not untouchable. He watches them file past. The room is quiet, and nobody in that room, not one person among the greatest soldiers of the ancient world, knows what he is thinking. That is where this story begins. Not at Gaugamela. Not at the moment he stood over the fallen Persian Empire and declared himself master of Asia. Here, in this room, in this silence, in the space between everything he conquered and the question that space opens. Because this story is not about how Alexander conquered the world. It is about what happened to him when he did. And underneath that, the harder question, the one that room in Babylon could not answer, and that the 13 years of campaign before it had been moving too fast to ask. When conquest was the only thing that ever made him feel like himself, who was he when there was nothing left to conquer? We do not know if he asked that question in those final days. We do not know if he had ever allowed himself to be still enough to ask it at all. Chapter 1. The boy who was built to be great. There is a specific kind of pressure that does not feel like pressure when you are inside it. It feels like love. It feels like preparation. It feels like the people around you understanding who you are before you are old enough to understand it yourself. Every lesson points in the same direction. Every story told about you confirms the same thing. Every person with power over your formation agrees, without needing to coordinate, on what you are supposed to become. You do not learn to question the direction. You learn to move faster toward it. Alexander of Macedon was born in the summer of 356 BC, in the royal capital of Pella. His father was one of the most capable rulers of the ancient world. His mother believed her son had been fathered by a god, and from the first day of his life, every person with authority over his childhood pointed in the same direction. They did not do this carelessly. They did it with complete conviction. Each of them had reasons that made sense within the world they inhabited. Philip II of Macedon had transformed a minor northern kingdom into the dominant military power in Greece through a combination of tactical innovation, relentless work, and a capacity for long-range thinking that his rivals consistently failed to match. He was not a sentimental man. He evaluated people and situations in terms of what they could produce, and the judgments he made on that basis were almost always correct. When Philip looked at his son, he saw the next phase of a project he had spent his reign building. This requires some explanation, because it is easy to read it as coldness, and it was not exactly coldness. In the ancient world, a king's son was not a private person in the way that word suggests today. He was the continuation of everything the father had built, the living guarantee that the work would outlast the man who had done it. Philip understood this and acted on it. Every decision he made about Alexander's formation was a decision about what the kingdom would need from the next generation. And what the kingdom would need was a conqueror. Philip had done the foundational work. He had reshaped the Macedonian army into the most effective fighting force in the Greek world. He had brought the city-states of Greece into a coalition under Macedonian leadership through a combination of military pressure and diplomatic maneuvering that stopped just short of outright conquest. But he understood, with the clarity of a man who had studied power his entire life, that what he had built required forward momentum to survive. Empires that stop expanding tend to collapse inward. The next generation would need to push east, toward Persia, toward the vast empire that had occupied Greek imagination since the Persian Wars a century and a half earlier. He chose Alexander for this before Alexander was old enough to choose anything. The education Philip arranged tells you the full weight of that choice. When Alexander was 13 years old, Philip hired Aristotle, not a competent tutor, not a respected local philosopher. Aristotle, already known across the Greek world as a mind of extraordinary range, a student of Plato who had travelled further than his teacher in almost every direction, a man who had thought seriously about biology, logic, ethics, politics, rhetoric, and the nature of the good life, and who had arrived at positions on all of these questions that would shape Western thought for 2,000 years. Philip offered him a significant fee and the reconstruction of his home city of Stagira, which Philip himself had previously destroyed. Aristotle accepted for 3 years in a garden sanctuary called Mieza. Aristotle taught Alexander philosophy, medicine, botany, geography, rhetoric, and the literature of the Greek world. He gave him Homer. Specifically, he gave him an annotated copy of the Iliad, and Alexander kept it for the rest of his life, carrying it through the Hindu Kush and across the Gedrosian desert and into Babylon, sleeping with it under his pillow alongside a dagger. That pairing is worth holding for a moment. The poem and the weapon, the story of Achilles, who chose a short, glorious life over a long, ordinary one, kept next to an instrument of killing, not casual reading, a mirror, a story Alexander had already decided was his own before Aristotle handed him the annotated copy. But the education at Mieza was not only about Homer. Aristotle believed, with the confidence of a man who had built a comprehensive philosophical system, that human beings were not equal in their capacity for excellence. Some people were fitted by nature for greatness in ways that others were not. The capacity for virtue, for reason, for the kind of achievement that left a mark on the world. These were distributed unevenly, and the man who possessed them in abundance was not only permitted to pursue greatness, he was, in some sense, obligated to. Alexander absorbed this not as a theory about humanity in general. He absorbed it as a description of himself, specifically. Which brings us to his mother. Olympias of Epirus was a woman of fierce intelligence, absolute devotion to her son, and a relationship with religious experience that the Macedonian court found unsettling. She was a devotee of Dionysus, involved in ecstatic rites that respectable court society regarded with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. She was also, by every account that survives, completely certain about one thing. Her son was not fully human, she told Alexander. At an age when children believe what their mothers tell them, that his true father was not Philip. His true father was Zeus, that she had conceived him through divine visitation, that the blood in his veins carried the heroic lines of Achilles and Heracles, and something greater than either behind them. We cannot know exactly when she first said this. We cannot know how a child receives that information at the age when identity is still forming, still plastic, still taking the shape of the stories it is given. What we can observe is what Alexander did with it for the rest of his life. He did not dismiss it. Now hold these three forces together. A father who had selected him as the instrument of an imperial project before he could speak. A philosopher who had taught him that certain individuals were, by nature, fitted for a greatness that most people could never reach. A mother who had told him his bloodline ran back to the gods. None of these three people were lying to him. Each of them believed what they told him. Philip genuinely thought he was preparing his son for real challenges that would require exceptional capability. Aristotle genuinely believed in the unequal distribution of human excellence. Olympias genuinely believed in the divine origin of her son, or believed in it enough that the distinction between belief and performance had long since collapsed. The question none of them asked, perhaps because it did not seem like a question worth asking, was what it does to a person to grow up inside that kind of agreement, when every voice with authority in your world points in exactly one direction. You do not develop the habit of asking whether the direction is right. You develop the habit of moving, and the moving feels like freedom because it is entirely your own, chosen each day with full commitment, undeniable in its momentum. Whether it is freedom in any deeper sense is a question the movement does not leave room to ask. There is one moment from Alexander's childhood that history has preserved with enough detail to be worth stopping at. He was around 10 years old when a horse trader arrived at the Macedonian court with a large black stallion that no one could ride. The animal was extraordinary by any measure, strong and fast, and with a presence that was immediately visible. It was also completely unmanageable. Every rider who attempted to mount it was thrown. Philip's best horseman tried and failed. Philip watched for a while and then told the trader to take the animal away. It was useless. Alexander had been watching too. And he had seen something. The horse was not wild. It was afraid. Specifically, it was frightened of its own shadow, which moved unpredictably in front of it as the riders positioned themselves with the sun behind them. Every attempt to mount it had made this worse, by placing the shadow exactly where the horse could see it most clearly. Alexander asked for a turn. Philip tried to dismiss him. Alexander persisted with the particular stubbornness of a child who is certain he has seen something the adults have missed. Philip agreed, perhaps amused, perhaps already reading something in his son that this moment was about to confirm. Alexander turned the horse to face the sun. The shadow fell behind them both. He spoke quietly to the animal, let it settle, stroked its nose without forcing anything. Then he mounted. The horse ran, not in panic, in the released energy of an animal that has finally been understood. Philip watched his 10-year-old son bring a horse that had defeated every adult in his court into a controlled gallop, and then bring it back. According to Plutarch, he wept, and he said to Alexander, "You will need to find a kingdom big enough for you, because Macedonia is too small." It is a remarkable thing to say to a child, and it settled something in Alexander's understanding of himself that the subsequent years of education and mythology only reinforced. He was the one who saw what others could not see. He was the one who could reach what others could not reach. He was the one for whom the normal constraints of size and expectation did not apply, because he had already demonstrated, at 10 years old, in front of his father and the entire court, that the constraints were not actually constraints for him. The horse was named Bucephalus. Alexander kept him until the animal died during the Indian campaign, 326 BC, somewhere near the Hydaspes River. He founded a city and named it after the horse. That loyalty, total and permanent across decades and continents, tells you something about what that moment in Pella meant to the boy who lived it. It tells you something else too. The relationship worked because Alexander had understood something no one else had. And that specific understanding had made him the only person in the world who could give the horse what the horse needed. He was irreplaceable to the animal. The animal needed him specifically. He would spend the rest of his life moving toward that feeling. In va. He would find it immediately and completely, in a way that nothing else in his life would ever quite match. Everything else would prove considerably more complicated. Chapter 2. The only environment. There is a difference between being good at something and needing it. A man who is good at something can set it down. He can walk away, return to it when circumstances require, pick it up again without the interval having cost him anything essential. The skill is his. He decides when to use it. A man who needs something cannot set it down in the same way. He can stop, but the stopping accumulates a pressure that does not ease until he returns. The thing he needs does not belong to him. He belongs to it. And the belonging is invisible to him precisely because it has been present for so long that he has no memory of existing without it. Alexander of Macedon was the greatest military commander of the ancient world. That is not a claim that requires much defense. The campaigns he ran, the distances he covered, the opponents he defeated, the logistics he managed across terrain and conditions that broke every conventional assumption about what an army could do. These achievements stand independently, and they are extraordinary. But there is a question the achievements do not answer. Watch where he positions himself in battle, not the strategy, not the tactical decisions. Watch where his body is, at the Granicus River, in 334 BC, the first major engagement of the Persian campaign. Alexander did not command from an elevated position with clear sight lines to the action below. He crossed the river at the front of his cavalry and rode directly into the densest concentration of Persian resistance on the opposite bank. A Persian nobleman named Spithridates came within one sword stroke of ending the entire campaign, raising his blade over Alexander's unprotected head before Clytus, one of Alexander's senior officers, killed the man from behind. Alexander survived by inches, and a fortunate intervention he had not arranged. He did not restructure his approach after that. He did not acknowledge, even privately to his closest companions, that perhaps a commander of his strategic importance should reconsider his physical position on the battlefield. At Issus the following year, he spotted Darius himself commanding from the Persian center, and drove his cavalry directly toward the king through the heaviest fighting, forcing Darius to flee and collapsing the Persian formation around that flight. At Gaugamela, the decisive battle of the war, he personally led the charge that broke the Persian center. Again, at the point of maximum danger, this pattern repeats across 13 years and dozens of engagements. It is not a youthful recklessness that maturity corrected. It is a consistent feature of how Alexander fought, present at the beginning of the campaign and present at the end, unchanged by the accumulation of experience that usually modifies the behavior of men who survive long enough to reflect on what has nearly killed them. The conventional explanation is inspiration. A commander who fights alongside his men generates a loyalty that no speech can produce. The soldiers who saw Alexander at the front of the charge, taking the same risks they were taking, would follow him anywhere and do anything he asked. That explanation is true. It does not account for the instances where the tactical situation did not require his personal exposure, where safer options existed, where the people around him were visibly frightened for his life and communicated that fear. And he moved toward the fighting anyway, with something that looked less like a calculated decision and more like relief. Like a man arriving somewhere he recognizes after a long time away, in battle. Nothing about Alexander was ambiguous. His role was absolute. Every decision had an immediate consequence. Every moment demanded complete presence. The noise and movement and physical reality of combat left no space for anything else. No other question could exist alongside the question of how to win what was directly in front of him. In battle, he knew exactly who he was. The record of Alexander between campaigns tells a different story. It is thinner, because ancient historians cared far more about what he did on the battlefield than what he did in camp or in court. But the fragments that survive are consistent enough to form a picture. He was difficult during extended periods of inactivity, volatile in ways that his closest companions learned to navigate carefully. The drinking that was a feature of Macedonian court culture was heavier in him during pauses in the campaign than during the campaign itself. The version of Alexander that appears in the sources between major engagements is recognizably less settled than the version that appears on the battlefield. Less certa, more reactive, more dependent on the people around him to regulate something that the fighting had previously regulated for him, now come to a moment late in the campaign, after much of what this story has yet to cover had already happened. The siege of a Mali city in what is now Pakistan, 325 BC. The campaign against the Mali was itself a response to the crisis at the Hyphasis River, which we will return to. By this point, the army had already turned back from India. They were moving toward home. In some sense, though the route Alexander had chosen made home feel further rather than closer. His own men begged him not to climb the walls of the besieged city himself. They had watched him in battle for years. They knew what he was going to do if he got to the top of those walls. They did not want to watch it. He climbed the walls anyway. He jumped down into the city with a small group and fought until an arrow went through his lung and he collapsed against the inside of the wall. His men broke through in a panic, convinced he was dead. He was not dead. The wound was severe, and the recovery was slow, and when he recovered, the campaign continued. There is no strategic explanation for what Alexander did at the Mali city. The siege would have been won without him climbing those walls. He was not demonstrating anything to an audience. He was not performing for the historical record. By that point in the campaign, the explanations that work for the early years do not fully hold. Something else was operating. The army itself had been shaped around his particular way of moving through the world. Philip had built the tactical foundation, the sarissa formations, the combined arms approach that integrated cavalry and infantry and specialist units into a flexible whole. Alexander transformed what that foundation could do by changing the speed at which it operated. He moved faster than anyone expected armies to move. He stripped away supply dependencies that slowed conventional forces, accepting logistical risks that more cautious commanders refused. He divided his forces when doctrine said to concentrate them, trusting his ability to bring them back together at the decisive point before the enemy could respond to the separation. He crossed mountain passes in winter that professional soldiers told him were impassable in winter. He crossed them anyway. The speed was not only tactical, it was the organizing rhythm of everything. While the army was moving, every question had a direction. Every hardship had a purpose that the next objective confirmed. Every morning, the camp broke and the column formed, and the direction was east and the purpose was clear. An army that is always moving does not have to ask where it is going. It is already on the way. He brought with him, on the Persian campaign, something no purely military commander would have included: scientists, botanists, geographers, historians, scholars whose function was to observe and record and name everything the army encountered, to give permanent form to the distances crossed and the territories entered and the rivers forded. Consider what those scholars were doing from the perspective of the record they produced. They were making the campaign real in a way that the campaign itself could not fully do. The army experienced the march. The scholars converted the experience into something that would exist after the march was over, something that could be pointed to and named and measured. The Greeks understood what that meant. Homer had done it for Achilles. Without the Iliad, Achilles was a soldier who fought well and died young. With the Iliad, he was something that 2,000 years of human civilization would be unable to stop reading. Alexander had carried the Iliad under his pillow since Aristotle gave it to him at Mieza. He understood what the record meant. At Gordium, in 333 BC, he encountered the Gordian knot. The legend held that whoever untied the impossibly complex knot, securing an ancient chariot to a post in the city's temple, would become master of Asia. Travelers had been attempting it for generations. The knot had defeated all of them. Alexander looked at it. He drew his sword and cut it in half. The traditional reading is that he demonstrated unconventional thinking, refusing to accept the terms of a problem and finding a solution outside the established rules. That reading is not wrong. There is something else in the gesture. The knot represented constraints established by tradition, by the accumulated attempts of everyone who had come before, by rules of a game that others had designed. Alexander did not attempt to solve the problem on its own terms. He ended the problem. He removed the framework within which the problem existed and replaced it with a framework in which the problem no longer mattered. This will appear again in his story. The refusal to accept that a situation has terms he is required to respect. At Gordium, it produced a moment that history has remembered for 2,000 years as a demonstration of genius. Later, it will produce something else entirely. Between 334 and 327 BC, Alexander won. He won at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela. He took Egypt without significant resistance. He crossed into the eastern territories of the Persian Empire and kept going, through Bactria and Sogdia, into terrain and conditions that his army had never encountered and that no Greek had ever mapped. Every morning the column formed. Every evening it had moved further east. The battles confirmed what the formation of his childhood had told him he was. The campaign was total, and the campaign was always there, and the question of who he was when it was not there did not need to arise. It was always there, until the day it was not. But we are not at that day yet. Before we reach it, something else happened. Something that did not announce itself as the most important development of the entire campaign. Something that looked, from the outside, like a political and religious formality in a distant Egyptian oasis. It was not a formality, and it would change everything that came after. Chapter 3. The Seduction of Myth. Power does not corrupt all at once. It corrupts the way water shapes stone, slowly, through repetition, through the accumulation of small moments, each one individually explicable, each one producing a shift so slight that no single instance seems worth examining, until one day you look at the stone and the original shape is gone, and you cannot identify the exact moment the change became irreversible. Alexander did not decide to become a god. He moved toward it one reasonable step at a time. And at each step, there was a logic, a political justification, a practical argument for why this particular accommodation to the mythology surrounding him was not vanity, but strategy. The logic was often genuinely correct. That is what makes this part of his story so difficult to read cleanly, and so necessary to read carefully. Egypt, 332 BC. Alexander has just taken the country without a significant battle. The Persian governor surrendered. The population, which had resented Persian rule for generations, received the Macedonians without the resistance that Egypt's strategic importance might have justified. It was one of the cleaner acquisitions of the entire campaign. At this point, with the Persian heartland still ahead of him and a war still very much in progress, Alexander did something that was not militarily necessary and not diplomatically required. He crossed the desert to the oracle at Siwa. The temple of Amun at Siwa was located in an oasis deep in the Libyan desert, several hundred miles west of the Nile Delta, across terrain that was genuinely hazardous. The oracle there was among the most respected in the ancient world. People traveled from across the Mediterranean to consult it, but no military objective required Alexander to go. No alliance depended on the visit. His generals did not recommend it. He went with a small group. Not the full army, something closer to a private journey than a diplomatic procession. The ancient sources differ on the details of what happened at Siwa. They agree on the outcome. The priests of Amun greeted Alexander as the son of the god, as pharaoh in the full Egyptian religious sense, which meant not a man who ruled on behalf of the divine, but a man in whom the divine was literally present. Alexander did not correct them. He asked the oracle questions, privately, and received answers that the sources tell us satisfied him completely. What the questions were, he told almost no one. When his mother Olympias wrote asking what the oracle had said, he wrote back that he would tell her in person when he returned to Macedonia. He never returned to Macedonia. He may have told no one. What the people around him observed was that he came back from Siwa with something settled in him that had perhaps been unsettled before. Not dramatically changed, not visibly transformed in any single way they could name. But something had found a resting place at Siwa that had not had one before the journey. Now consider the political reality of Egypt, independently of whatever happened in that inner chamber at Siwa. Alexander needed Egypt, its grain-fed armies, its wealth-funded campaigns. Its position in the Mediterranean anchored his western flank against any possibility of pressure from that direction while he moved east. He could not govern Egypt effectively as a foreign conqueror imposing alien rule. Egypt had a coherent religious and political framework for legitimate authority, and that framework required its ruler to be pharaoh in the full sense the tradition understood. So, accepting the title, accepting the religious framing, allowing himself to be presented to Egyptian subjects as the son of Amun, made real political sense. The logic was there. It was genuine logic, not invented after the fact, to justify something he had already decided to do, and he had traveled across a dangerous desert before any political necessity required it, in something closer to a private pilgrimage than a diplomatic visit, to receive confirmation of something he had been carrying since childhood. Both of those things are true simultaneously. A man who has been told since before he could form his own opinions that he was descended from gods, who was taught by the greatest philosopher of his age that certain individuals were, by nature, fitted for a level of excellence unreachable by ordinary people, who had then spent a decade winning battles that should have been impossible, that man is not approaching the oracle at Siwa as a pure political calculator, weighing costs and benefits. He is approaching it as someone for whom the confirmation, if it came, would not be news. It would be recognition. Siwa gave him the recognition. What he did with it in the years that followed is where the story becomes more complicated. Persepolis, 330 BC, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the city that represented, more completely than any other, the power and the pride of everything Alexander had spent 6 years defeating. Its treasury contained wealth that staggered even the Macedonians, who had already passed through cities of extraordinary richness. Alexander had been careful throughout the campaign to present himself as something more than a conqueror. He was the legitimate successor of the Persian kings, the rightful inheritor of what he had taken, a new center around which the same world would reorganize itself under different management. This was intelligent politics. It reduced resistance. It gave the populations he conquered a way of understanding his arrival that did not require them to experience themselves as simply defeated. Persepolis burned. The ancient sources offer different explanations. One account describes it as a deliberate political decision, a symbolic act, marking the formal end of the War of Revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece a century and a half earlier. Another describes it as something that began at a banquet, with wine and firelight, and a suggestion from an Athenian woman named Thais that became an action before anyone fully understood what was happening. What the sources agree on is the sequence that followed. Alexander watched the city burn, and the next morning, according to Plutarch, he walked through the ruins and felt regret. The act. Then the regret. Not prevention, not restraint in the moment when restraint was still possible. The regret came when the thing was already ash and could not be recalled. That sequence would appear again. The question of proskynesis arrived in 327 BC. During the difficult years in Bactria and Sogdia, the territories that are now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, Alexander began requiring, or strongly encouraging, the Persian court practice of deep prostration in his presence. In Persian court culture, this was a gesture of respect with political meaning, but without necessarily implying that the person before whom it was performed was divine. In Greek and Macedonian culture, it was a gesture reserved for gods alone. To perform it before a human being was to make a category error of the most serious kind. Alexander wanted it from everyone. His official explanation was administrative. He was now ruler of a vast empire with subjects from many different cultural traditions. A unified court ritual that all subjects performed regardless of origin would reduce the visible hierarchy between Macedonians, who held a privileged position in the empire's power structure, and Persians and Bactrians, who occupied a different position. If everyone prostrated themselves before Alexander, then, in that gesture at least, everyone was equal. The argument has real merit as a piece of imperial administration. Historians have made serious cases for it on those grounds. But the argument does not account for the intensity with which Alexander pursued it, or the reaction that followed when it was refused. Callisthenes refused. Callisthenes was the nephew of Aristotle. He had been appointed as the official historian of the campaign, the man whose specific function was to record what Alexander was doing for the Greek world at home. He was, by his position alone, one of the most consequential voices shaping how Alexander would be understood by posterity. At a banquet where proskynesis was being tested, moving around the room with varying degrees of compliance from different attendees, Callisthenes performed something between the two gestures, a movement that satisfied neither the Greek nor the Persian standard. Alexander noticed. A promised reward was withheld. The tension between them deepened over subsequent months. When a conspiracy among Alexander's royal pages was discovered, Callisthenes was implicated. On what grounds the evidence does not make clear. He was arrested. He died in custody. Whether by execution or by the conditions of his imprisonment, the ancient sources do not agree. What is clear is the function he occupied in Alexander's world and the fact of his removal from it. Callisthenes was not a military rival. He held no army and commanded no resources that could threaten Alexander's position. He was a historian who had refused a gesture and who had written things about Alexander's behavior that circulated in Greece and that Alexander found unflattering. He was, in the most direct possible description, honest feedback from someone with the standing to make honest feedback matter, and he ended up in chains. Now, hold that fact alongside something else. Between Egypt and Bactria, between Siwa and the Proskynesis crisis, Alexander was also building. Alexandria in Egypt was already taking shape as what would become one of the great cities of the ancient world, a center of learning and commerce that would outlast every other thing he created by many centuries. He was making genuine efforts to integrate Persian nobles into his administration, to create a governing structure more durable than simple military occupation. He was thinking about the long run in ways that many conquerors never bother to think. The man who had Callisthenes arrested and the man who founded Alexandria were the same man in the same years. That is the part of this story that resists the clean moral accounting that histories of Alexander often reach for. The seduction of myth did not replace his capabilities or dissolve his intelligence. It ran alongside them. The god and the administrator inhabited the same body, and for a considerable time they did not obviously undermine each other. What they undermined was something less visible and less easily named. There was one person in Alexander's world before whom none of this applied. His name was Hephaestion. They had known each other since boyhood, possibly since the years at Mieza, possibly earlier. By the time of the Persian campaign, they were inseparable, in a way that the people around them had long since stopped remarking on because it was simply the nature of their relationship. As fixed and unremarkable as any other feature of the campaign's landscape, when Alexander visited Troy at the beginning of the campaign, he laid a wreath at the tomb of Achilles. Hephaestion laid a wreath at the tomb of Patroclus. The identification was deliberate, and it was public. Alexander was placing their relationship within the mythological framework that structured his understanding of himself, and he was doing it in front of everyone, at the very beginning of the campaign that would define his life. Achilles and Patroclus, the great hero and the person who knew him before the heroism, who traveled with it, who was present for the parts of it that the heroism did not reach. In Egypt, people bowed before Alexander as the son of Ammon. In Persia, his subjects prostrated themselves. In Bactria, every interaction with him passed through the accumulated weight of what he had become. The titles and the victories and the divine sonship and the distance that power of that magnitude places between the person who holds it and everyone else. Hephaestion looked at him the way someone looks at a person they have known so long and so completely that the looking is simply a continuation of the knowing. Everyone else in Alexander's world related to him through what he had become. Hephaestion related to him through what he had always been. The boy from Pella who had read Homer with genuine feeling and not only strategic self-identification. The person who existed underneath the campaign, underneath the oracle's confirmation, underneath the proskynesis and the divine titles and the myth that had accumulated around him, like layers of stone, until the stone and the person inside it had become very difficult to distinguish from the outside. With everyone else, Alexander was performing the version of himself that the world required. With Hephaestion, the performance could stop. That mattered more than the people around them perhaps understood, and it would matter most when it was gone. Chapter 4. Collision with the Limit. There is a specific kind of man who can face any external obstacle with clarity and force. Put a river in front of him, and he finds the crossing. Put a mountain range in front of him, and he finds the pass. Put an army of 200,000 soldiers in front of him, and he finds the point where their formation is weakest and drives everything he has directly into that point before they can adjust. This kind of man is not stopped by the world. He is stopped, if he is stopped at all, by something the world cannot provide an alternative to. He is stopped by a limit that comes from inside the people who love him, because, for that, he has no weapon. The road east had been the organizing principle of Alexander's existence for 8 years. Every morning the army woke up and there was a direction. Every decision, however costly, however brutal, however far from anything that could be called comfortable, could be measured against a single question. Does this move us forward? Forward was east. East was always there. Until it was not. The Hyphasis River. 326 BC. Alexander's army had crossed into the Indian subcontinent and defeated the powerful King Porus in a battle fought in monsoon rain across a flooding river. One of the most technically demanding engagements of the entire campaign. They had pushed further east than any Greek force in history. They were in territory no Macedonian had ever seen, fighting enemies they had never encountered, in a climate that was working against them with heat and disease and floods that turned the ground beneath their feet into something unreliable. They had done all of this. They were still moving, still winning. Alexander wanted to continue east. His sources, whether accurate or not, told him that beyond the Hyphasis lay more kingdoms, more territory, and eventually the great ocean that the Greeks believed encircled the entire world. If he could reach it, he would have conquered everything. Not almost everything. Everything. The army sat down, not in the way armies sit down when they mutiny. No weapons were raised. No officers were confronted in the night. It was quieter than that, and in some ways more complete. 8 years of marching had produced an exhaustion that had moved past muscle and bone into something that rest alone could not repair. They had not seen their homes since 334 BC. They had children who had been born while they were gone, and were old enough now to be walking. They had parents who had aged into old age while the campaign moved east and kept moving east, and gave no sign of stopping. They wanted to go home. The man who said this to Alexander was Coenus. This is the detail that the conventional account of the Hyphasis tends to move past, and it is the most important detail in the entire episode. Coenus was not a frightened soldier looking for a reason to stop. He was not a disloyal subordinate advancing his own interests at Alexander's expense. He was one of Alexander's most trusted and capable generals, a man who had fought beside him from the very beginning of the Persian campaign, who had distinguished himself at Gaugamela and in the brutal fighting in Bactria and at the Hydaspes crossing against Porus. He had given 8 years of his life to this campaign with a consistency and a competence that had never wavered. He stood up in the assembly Alexander had called to prepare the army for the advance across the Hyphasis. And he spoke. He said the men were spent. He said they missed their families. He said that what had been accomplished was already extraordinary, and that pushing further east would not add to its greatness, but would cost lives that had already given everything that could reasonably be asked of them. He said all of this with evident respect for Alexander, with the visible affection of a man who had followed him across the known world and meant every step of it. He said, "Enough. A hostile army says no with weapons. You can fight weapons. You know how to fight weapons. Weapons are the language of the battlefield, and Alexander spoke that language better than any man alive, a man who has marched beside you for 8 years. who has bled in your campaigns and trusted you with his life and earned your trust completely with his. That man says no, with the weight of everything the two of you have shared. He says no, with the specific authority of someone who knows you, who has seen what this costs, and who loves you enough to say what the people who only fear you would never dare to say. Alexander had no answer for that. He retreated to his tent. He stayed there for 3 days. The sources describe this as a period of deliberation. A commander taking time to consider his options and consult the omens and arrive at a decision through the proper channels. That reading preserves the dignity of the moment. What the 3 days look like, measured against everything we know about how Alexander operated, is a man who has encountered something he cannot overcome and cannot refuse and cannot find a way around. Every obstacle the campaign had placed in front of him had been solvable by the application of force or intelligence or speed or some combination of the three. This obstacle was none of those things. It was the exhaustion of the people he had led, expressed by the most loyal among them, and it had no solution that his available tools could produce. He emerged from the tent on the 3rd day and announced that the gods had given unfavorable omens for continuing east. The army would turn back. He gave it the language of divine will. He wrapped it in the vocabulary of religion and ritual that gave his decisions their authority and removed from the visible record the reality of what had actually happened. But everyone who had been in that assembly, everyone who had watched Coenus stand up and speak, and watched Alexander go into his tent for 3 days, understood what had occurred. Coenus died a few days after the army turned. Of illness. The sources say he had survived 8 years of the most demanding military campaign in the ancient world and died of sickness in the weeks immediately following the one moment when he had successfully told Alexander no. History does not record how Alexander received that death. Coenus disappears from the account at the moment. His presence becomes complicated. The army turned west, and Alexander chose the route home, with a decision that no one around him fully understood and that the strategic situation did not require. He chose the Gedrosian desert. The Gedrosia is a vast wasteland in what is now southern Pakistan and southeastern Iran. It offered no reliable water sources across long stretches. Temperatures in the summer months that killed without shelter, and terrain that made moving a large force through it a logistical problem of the highest difficulty. There was a coastal route that would have been hard but manageable. Alexander did not take it. The ancient sources give various explanations. He wanted to establish supply depots for the fleet moving along the coast. He wanted to surpass the mythological rulers, Semiramis and Cyrus the Great, who had supposedly attempted the crossing and mostly failed. He wanted to open a land route between India and Persia. None of these explanations, taken alone or together, fully accounts for the choice. What the desert offered, that the coastal road did not, was this: it could still be crossed. It could still be defeated. There was still something here that required everything from the people attempting it, that separated those who survived from those who did not, that produced in the crossing a kind of achievement that the mere act of walking home along a known road could never produce. The kingdoms had run out at the hyphasis. The army had stopped moving east. The limit had been imposed not by any force Alexander could fight, but by the exhaustion of the people he had led. But the desert was still there. The desert was still a problem that could be solved by the application of will and endurance and the refusal to stop. He took the army through it. Thousands of people died in the Gedrosian crossing, not in battle, from thirst in the stretches between water sources, from heat in the hours of the day when the sun made movement impossible and rest in the exposed terrain made survival uncertain. women and children who traveled with the army, as was customary in ancient campaigns, died in significant numbers. A flash flood in the night destroyed supplies and killed people who were sleeping in what appeared to be a safe location and was not. Alexander marched through all of it. At one point, according to Arrian, a soldier found a small amount of water and brought it to Alexander in a helmet. There was not enough for the whole army, and the soldier wanted his commander to have it. Alexander took the helmet. He held it for a moment so that the men around him could see it. Then he poured the water into the sand. He would not drink what his men could not drink. It is one of the genuinely moving gestures in his story. Real solidarity, real identification with the suffering of the people around him. A refusal of privilege that cost him something real in a moment when the cost was visible to everyone present. It is also happening in a crossing he chose to make. Through a desert he did not have to enter. Under conditions he imposed on his army after the campaign, they had already given everything to complete. Both of those things are true, and neither of them cancels the other. The army that came out of Gedrosia was smaller and in many respects harder than the army that had gone in. Shared suffering of that magnitude creates bonds that easier roads cannot produce. They had survived something together that most people would not have survived. That meant something real to the men who came through it. It did not answer the question that the hyphasis had opened, because the desert, once crossed, was crossed. There was no more desert. The achievement was real and finished, and it left Alexander in exactly the same position that crossing any obstacle left him, looking for what came next. In the months after Gedrosia, during the long process of reorganizing the empire and managing the administration of territories that now required governing rather than conquering, a pattern that had been present since the early years of the campaign began to change in character. He was drinking more heavily than before. The ancient sources note this with enough consistency and enough specific detail to take it seriously as an observable fact rather than as hostile invention. Drinking had always been part of Macedonian court culture and had never been absent from Alexander's life. But the accounts of extended drinking sessions become more frequent after India, and the behavior surrounding them becomes more volatile, more unpredictable, more difficult for the people around him to manage with the quiet competence they had developed over years of close proximity to his moods. And in the courts and councils of the reorganized empire, a different kind of unease had taken hold. Conspiracies had been discovered. Officers had been implicated in plots. Some real, some possibly manufactured from the paranoia that absolute power generates when it has been held long enough in conditions of stress. Executions had followed. The atmosphere of trust and shared purpose that had characterized the early years of the campaign, the genuine sense that Alexander and his companions were in this together and that the together was real and mutual, had developed fractures that were no longer invisible from the inside. Power that has been absolute for long enough stops feeling like a relationship and starts feeling like a condition. The people around it stop being companions and start being variables in a calculation. Alexander had not designed this. He had not wanted it. But wanting and designing were no longer the primary forces shaping what happened in his court. Something was shaping it now that had been building since Siwa, since Persepolis, since Proskynesis and the removal of Callisthenes, since the god and the man had begun sharing the same space without either of them being willing to fully yield to the other. Through all of it, Hephaestion had been there, the one person before whom none of these dynamics applied, the one relationship in Alexander's world that the campaign had not reorganized around his authority and his mythology, and the distance that both of those things placed between him and everyone else. Hephaestion was still there. For a little while longer. Chapter 5. The death of the witness. Ecbatana, 324 BC. The city is celebrating. Alexander has ordered games and festivals on a scale that reflects the wealth of everything the campaign has taken. There is music and athletic competition, and the kind of elaborate public spectacle that empires produce when they want to remind themselves and their subjects of their own greatness. The mood in the city is the closest thing to lightness that the months since the hyphasis have generated. Hephaestion is sick. The illness began as a fever. Fevers moved through ancient armies with regularity, and most healthy men survived them if they rested and ate carefully, and did not push themselves before they were ready. The physician, attending him, a man named Glaucias, gave standard instructions. Rest. No wine. Hephaestion followed these instructions for 7 days. On the 7th day, feeling better, he ate a large meal and drank half a bottle of wine and returned to bed. By the time Alexander was summoned from the games, Hephaestion was beyond help. He died before Alexander reached him. What followed is recorded in the ancient sources with enough consistency and enough specific detail that it cannot be softened into the conventional language of a commander mourning a valued officer. Alexander threw himself on the body and stayed there. For the better part of a day he would not leave and would not speak and refused food. When he finally rose, he ordered the manes and tails of all horses cut as a sign of mourning. He ordered the battlements of the surrounding cities demolished. He ordered all music stopped across the empire. He had Glaucias executed for failing to save his patient. He did not eat for several days. He cut his own hair in the gesture of grief that Achilles had made for Patroclus. The gesture he had recognized immediately at Troy at the beginning of the campaign, because he had been carrying that story inside him since he was 13 years old. He wrote to the oracle at Siwa requesting that Hephaestion be worshipped as a divine hero. The oracle confirmed it. Alexander was not satisfied. He wanted Hephaestion declared a full god, not merely a hero. The oracle declined to grant this. Alexander began planning a funeral, monument of a scale, the ancient sources describe, with numbers that suggest an intention beyond anything. A rational calculation of memorial resources would justify. Then he took his army into the mountains and went to war against the Cosaeans. The Cosaeans were a people living in the hills near Ecbatana. They had not done anything specific to provoke this. They were not a strategic threat. They were not blocking a road or withholding tribute or threatening a garrison. They were in the hills, and Alexander marched his army into those hills in the middle of winter and killed a very large number of them. The ancient sources state plainly what this was: a sacrifice, an offering for Hephaestion's spirit. The dead would accompany his companion into whatever came after. Sit with that for a moment before moving past it. This is not the behavior of a man who has made a political calculation about how to project strength after a personal loss. This is not performance for the court or for the historical record. This is a man who has lost the most important person in his world and whose only available language for what he is feeling is the language he has spoken his entire life. He could not undo what had happened. He could not reach back through the 7 days of fever and the meal and the half bottle of wine and change the outcome. These were the kinds of limits that no campaign had ever placed on him because they existed entirely outside the territory where his capabilities operated. The fighting at Gaugamela had been a solvable problem. The crossing of the Hindu Kush had been a solvable problem. Even the hyphasis, devastating as it had been a problem he could eventually move away from by choosing a different direction. This was not solvable. This was not movable. This was simply what had happened, fixed and permanent and entirely indifferent to everything he was capable of. So he moved an army into the mountains, and he made something happen that would not have happened without him. It was not the same as what he had lost. Nothing could be. But it was action in the face of the thing that action could not change. And action was the only response he had ever learned. Now step back from the Cossian campaign and ask a different question. What had actually been lost when Hephaestion died? The easy answer is a friend, a companion of 30 years. Perhaps more. Someone whose absence would leave a specific and painful hole in the daily texture of a life. That is real, and it is not a small thing, and in ordinary circumstances it would be sufficient as an explanation for the grief. But the grief at Ecbatana was not ordinary grief, and what it points toward is something that the word friend does not fully capture. Go back to Troy. The beginning of the campaign, Alexander laying a wreath at the tomb of Achilles, while Hephaestion laid one at the tomb of Patroclus. That identification was not casual. Alexander understood the Iliad with the depth of someone who had read it as a personal document rather than as a cultural artifact. He knew what Patroclus was to Achilles in that poem. Not only a companion, the person who knew Achilles before he was Achilles, who had been present for the formation of the hero, and who carried that knowledge forward into every year of the heroism that followed. The person before whom the performance of being Achilles could, occasionally and imperfectly, stop. By 324 BC, Alexander's world was populated entirely by people who related to him through what he had become. His generals saw the commander who had led them across the known world. His Persian subjects saw the king of kings. His Macedonian court saw the figure who had claimed divine parentage and demanded prostration and burned Persepolis and crossed the Gedrosian desert. His new wife Roxana saw the conqueror who had taken her from her father's household in Bactria and made her a queen. They all saw Alexander the Great. Hephaestion had known Alexandros, the boy from Pella who had been frightened the night before his first engagement and would never have admitted it to another person alive, the young man who had read Homer with genuine feeling, who had wept at passages in the Iliad, not because weeping was strategically appropriate, but because the poem reached something in him that the campaign had not yet armored over. The person who existed underneath all of it, underneath the oracle's confirmation and the divine titles and the 13 years of victories, the person who had been forming before any of that arrived and who had perhaps been disappearing beneath it for years without anyone, including Alexander himself, quite noticing. Every human being needs at least one relationship in which the performance can stop, in which the version of yourself that the world requires can be set down, even briefly, even imperfectly, and something less constructed can exist in its place. Hephaestion was that relationship. When he died, Alexander did not only lose a companion of 30 years, he lost the last person alive who carried evidence of who he had been before he became what the world now required him to be. And without that evidence, without that witness, the question of who he actually was beneath the campaign and the mythology became unanswerable in a new way. Not unanswerable because the answer was lost somewhere and needed to be recovered. Unanswerable because the person whose presence had been the answer was gone. There is a detail in the ancient sources from the months after Hephaestion's death that is easy to read past and should not be. Alexander became increasingly preoccupied with omens. This is the man who had looked at a horse that defeated every rider in Macedonia and seen immediately that the animal was simply afraid of its own shadow. The man who had cut the Gordian knot rather than engage with the problem on the terms it presented. The man who had crossed mountain passes that his most experienced generals told him were impassable in winter and had been right to cross them. A man whose relationship with conventional constraint had always been, at minimum, skeptical. That man began in the months after Ecbatana to receive unfavorable signs with an anxiety his companions found difficult to recognize as his He made decisions, or delayed decisions, in response to the movements of birds and the condition of sacrificial animals, in ways that went beyond the normal religious practice of a Macedonian king into something that looked more like a person who had lost access to his own internal compass and was searching the external world for signals. To replace it, when the compass you have navigated by your entire life stops giving readings, you look for other instruments. He returned to Babylon. Babylon made strategic sense as the administrative center of an empire of this scale. It was centrally located, had the infrastructure for a large governing apparatus, had symbolic weight as one of the great cities of the ancient world. The practical argument for it was real. Seers had warned him against entering Babylon. Multiple warnings from multiple sources, delivered with enough specificity and enough persistence that they could not be easily dismissed as the noise that always surrounds a powerful figure. The man who had dismissed the warnings of experienced generals about the mountain passes considered these warnings seriously. He altered his approach to the city. He attempted to enter from a different direction when the initial approach produced further unfavorable signs. He took the warnings with a gravity that the people around him, who had watched him refuse to take the advice of cautious generals on every dangerous battlefield of the campaign, found strange. He entered Babylon eventually, because the alternative was to allow omens to dictate the movement of an empire, and that was not something Alexander could permit. But the fact of the warnings, and the fact of how seriously he received them, says something about where he was in those final months, something the ancient sources record without quite articulating. In Babylon, he planned new campaigns: Arabia, Carthage, the Western Mediterranean. The planning was serious, and the resources available to execute it were real. This was not fantasy. An empire of his size could genuinely have moved in these directions, and Alexander had the military apparatus to lead such movements with a reasonable expectation of success. But there is a question the planning raises that the sources do not ask directly. Was this what he wanted, or was this simply what he knew how to do? Those two things had perhaps been the same for most of his life. The wanting and the doing had moved together for so long that distinguishing between them had never required any effort. But in Babylon, in the months after Ecbatana, in the aftermath of the Hyphasis and Gedrosia, and everything that had accumulated since the campaign turned west, they may have begun to come apart in a way that no new campaign could fully close. The machine knew how to plan the next campaign. Whether the man inside the machine still knew why the campaign mattered is a question the evidence circles without answering. One evening in late spring of 323 BC, Alexander attended a banquet at the house of a Macedonian officer named Medius. He drank heavily. By most accounts, he drank very heavily, though the details vary in ways that suggest they were already being shaped by the interests of the people recording them in the days and weeks that followed. After the banquet, he developed a fever. He had survived fevers before. He had survived a punctured lung at the Mali city, and an arrow through his shoulder at the Granicus, and wounds that would have ended most men before the campaign reached its second year. He was not someone who yielded easily to what the body produced against him. The fever did not break. For 10 days he declined. His generals gathered. His senior officers requested access, wanting to see him with their own eyes before they fully believed what the rumors moving through the army were saying. He was too weak to receive them in the normal way. They filed through the room where he lay. On by on, he watched them come and go. When they asked who he left his empire to, he said, in one version of the account, to the strongest. In another version, he said nothing at all. He gave his ring to the general Perdiccas. He had no formal heir. He had made no settled arrangement for what came after. He died on the 11th of June, 323 BC. He was 32 years old. The cause remains genuinely uncertain across 2,300 years of examination. Typhoid fever is the most commonly proposed explanation. Poisoning has been argued and disputed continuously since the days immediately following his death. The effects of the Mali wound, never fully healed, may have made him vulnerable to what the fever found. The drinking, sustained and heavy in the final months, may have contributed in ways that the ancient sources note but do not specifically account for. We do not know. We will probably not know. What we know is that the fever came and did not break, and that the room in Babylon went quiet in a way that no room in Alexander's life had ever been quiet before. There was no plan for what came after. There was no heir, no settled succession, no arrangement for the world to continue in an organized way. Once the person at its center was no longer there, the man who had organized the crossing of mountain ranges and deserts and flooded rivers across 13 years of continuous campaigning had left no instructions for the morning after his death. His generals would argue for 6 days over what to do with his body. 6 days. The man who had answered every question about the next military objective within hours had left the people closest to him with no answer for this one. He had not planned for a world without himself at the center of it. Perhaps because, for Alexander, that world was genuinely unimaginable. There was only the campaign, and the campaign was over. Chapter 6. The cost and the question. Start with a number. 1 million. That is a conservative scholarly estimate of the people who died as a direct result of Alexander's campaigns between 334 and 323 BC. Some historians place the figure considerably higher. The uncertainty exists because the ancient world did not keep records designed to count the dead with precision, and because the dead included not only soldiers killed in pitched battle, but civilians massacred in conquered cities, populations sold into slavery, people who died of famine and disease when armies moved through their territories and consumed what those territories had produced, and soldiers who died not from enemy action, but from the conditions of the march itself. 1 million is a flaw. That number needs to sit here for a moment before anything else is said about legacy or cultural transmission or the long reach of Greek civilization across the centuries. Not because the number cancels everything else in this story, but because the habit of moving past it quickly, of acknowledging it in a sentence, and then returning to the genius of the tactics and the drama of the battles, is itself part of the problem with how Alexander is usually told. The people inside that number did not experience his campaigns as a chapter in the history of Western civilization. They experienced them as the end of everything. Thebes, 335 BC, before the Persian campaign had even begun. Alexander destroyed the city and sold its surviving population into slavery. Thebes had been one of the great cities of Greece, the city that had defeated Sparta at Leuctra a generation earlier and changed the balance of Greek power in ways that were still being felt. It ceased to exist as a functioning city because it had chosen the wrong position in a political dispute with Macedonia. Alexander was 21 years old when he made that decision. Turi, 332 BC. The city resisted his siege for 7 months with genuine ingenuity and courage, constructing counter-siege weapons and fighting with the focused intensity of people who understood what capture would mean. When the walls finally broke, Alexander had 2,000 of the surviving defenders crucified along the beach. The rest of the population was sold into slavery. Persepolis burned. The Gedrosian crossing killed thousands, not in battle, but from thirst and heat and the conditions of a march Alexander chose to make through a desert he did not have to enter. The Cosseian campaign killed an unknown number of people who had done nothing to Alexander except exist in the hills near the city where Hephaestion had died. These are not aberrations in an otherwise clean record. They are part of the same record as the founding of Alexandria and the defeat of Darius and the crossing of the Hindu Kush. They belong to the same story. The man who built one of the great cities of the ancient world and the man who sold the population of Thebes into slavery were not different men operating in different modes. They were the same man, making decisions from the same center, in the same years, with the same capabilities and the same limitations. The achievement and the cost are not two separate things that happened alongside each other. They are the same thing seen from different positions by different people who did not have the option of choosing which position they occupied. Now consider what survived. The empire did not survive. Within 2 years of Alexander's death, his generals had begun the wars that would divide it into competing kingdoms. Within 20 years, the unified empire he had spent 13 years building existed only in the historical record. Within a generation, the people who had actually known him were dying or dead, and the kingdoms that carried his legacy forward were fighting each other with the same energy they had once directed east. His wife Roxana had state heir. His other wife, and the daughter of Darius, killed within weeks of his death. Olympias, his mother, was executed in the wars that followed. His son, born after his death and named Alexander, was murdered before he reached adolescence. The people closest to the center of what he had built were destroyed by the collapse of what he had not planned for. The cities he founded lasted longer than the empire, and one of them lasted much longer. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the great centers of human knowledge in the ancient world. Its library, in the centuries after Alexander's death, assembled the largest collection of written knowledge that had ever existed in one place. The works of Greek philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, and literature that would shape the intellectual inheritance of Western civilization for 2,000 years were preserved, copied, and transmitted through Alexandria. That is a real and consequential legacy. It outlasted every army and every political arrangement that Alexander produced by many centuries. It is also a legacy he did not specifically intend. He founded Alexandria because founding cities was part of how he administered and conquered territory, and because the location was strategically sound. The library was built by the Ptolemies, his successors in Egypt, 2 generations after his death. The intellectual culture that made Alexandria what it became grew from conditions he had created without designing the specific outcome. The legacy that lasted was not the one he planned. What he did plan, the unified empire, the unbroken line of conquest from Greece to India, the personal authority at the center of everything, lasted almost no time at all. Julius Caesar wept when he stood before a statue of Alexander in Spain. He was in his early 30s, the age at which Alexander had already conquered the known world, and Caesar had not yet done anything that would be remembered. The weeping was the recognition of a gap between what Alexander had achieved and what Caesar had so far managed to produce. Caesar went on to close that gap considerably. He also went on to repeat, with the particular variation that his own character and his own era required, the central failure that Alexander's story demonstrates. He built a system organized around his own indispensability and made no durable arrangement for what came after. He was assassinated in the Senate chamber he had been using as the theater of his own authority, by men who had concluded that the system and the man were the same thing, and that removing the man would therefore remove the system, they were not entirely wrong about the connection. They were wrong about the outcome. Napoleon studied Alexander's campaigns with the systematic attention of a professional soldier extracting tactical lessons from historical material. He applied those lessons with extraordinary effect. He also built a system that required him at its center, created no institutions durable enough to survive his removal, and ended on an island far from everything he had made, dictating his version of events to anyone who would record it. The pattern repeated, not because Napoleon was ignorant of Alexander's failure, but because the qualities that made both men capable of what they achieved were not separable from the qualities that made them incapable of what they did not achieve. The capacity for absolute forward movement and the incapacity for the patient institutional work that durable systems require are not two different personality traits that happen to coexist in the same person. They are the same quality, operating in different contexts. The problem Alexander could not solve is not a problem of the 4th century BC. It is a problem of any life built entirely around one thing. He simply lived it at a scale that made it impossible to look away from. And we have not solved it. We have found more sophisticated ways of not noticing that we have not solved it. The mechanisms by which modern life constructs identity around achievement and performance, and the accumulation of things that can be measured and compared, are more elaborate now than they were in Macedonia. They are more invisible, precisely because they are more pervasive. But the question they avoid is the same question. When the thing that makes you feel like yourself is no longer available, what remains? Alexander's answer, as far as the evidence allows us to reconstruct it, was to keep moving, cross another desert, plan another campaign, find something that still required everything from him and give it everything he had. It kept him in motion. It did not keep him whole. Come back to the room. Babylon, June, 323 BC. The generals are filing past. He watches them come and go. He cannot speak. The room is quiet in a way that no room in his life has ever been quiet before, because there is nothing left to move toward, and no one left who remembers the person he was before the moving began. The question this story opened with was this: when conquest was the only thing that ever made him feel like himself, who was he when there was nothing left to conquer? The honest answer, after everything we have seen, is that we do not know, and there is a real possibility that he did not know either, not because the answer was hidden somewhere inside him, waiting to be found if he had only stopped long enough to look, but because the question requires a stillness to ask that the entire architecture of his life had been designed, by himself and by everyone around him, to make unnecessary. Philip had given him a direction. Aristotle had given him a framework. Olympias had given him a story. The campaign had given him a purpose that was renewed every morning by the direction the column was facing. He had never needed to ask who he was beneath all of that. The campaign had always been there, answering the question before it could fully form. At the hyphasis, the campaign stopped. At Ecbatana, the witness died. In Babylon, the fever came, and the room went quiet. His body lay in Babylon for 6 days before anyone could agree on what to do with it. 6 days. No clear air. No settled succession. No instructions for the morning after his death. The man who had organized the crossing of mountain ranges and rivers and deserts had left no plan for this. There was only the campaign, and the campaign was over.